Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Belle Wheelan, President of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges. Her career spans over 40 years, includes the role of faculty members, Chief Student Services Officer, Campus Provost, College President, and Secretary of Education for the state of Virginia. Those in higher ed know the familiar acronym SACS, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. But for Belle, it also means students are central to success, a fitting description for what has motivated her for her career. I've known Belle for many years, and I am blessed to call her a friend. And I welcome her to the show today to talk about the state of higher education accreditation. Belle, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Drumm. Appreciate being here.
Oh, I'm going to have a lot of fun with you today. We've got so many things to talk about. I mean, we go back a few years anyway, and it's nice to have somebody that I can call a friend on the program.
Well, good. Glad to be here.
We're going to talk about accreditation, but before we get started on that, you've had an amazing career. And sometimes I'm sure you think it's time to end it. But tell us a little bit about how you got here, because you've been with SACS now for over 10 years.
I'm in year 18 with SACSCOC, as a matter of fact. I began my career 48 years ago, this past August. I was a mere babe as a faculty member of psychology at San Antonio College in Texas. And I said I'm probably the only person on this earth who began their career at SAC and will end it at SACS. I graduated from LSU with my master's. I had been in a doctoral program, but my mother took ill, so I terminated with a master's. And in 1974, we weren't aware of as many career opportunities in psychology if it wasn't in clinical psychology, but I could teach. And in San Antonio at the time, they had two community colleges. One was San Antonio College, the other was St. Philip's College. And St. Philip's had been the historically black college. And so I knew all the administrators and a lot of the faculty because I had grown up with them, or my mother went to school with them, or my grandmother went to church with them. And so I went bopping over to St. Philip's looking for a job, except the chairwoman of the psych department was a white female who told me she had one black woman working for her. She didn't need another one. So go try SAC. So I went to SAC. They didn't have one. They hired me on the spot. And I spent 10 years as a faculty member teaching psychology. In year 8, I went back to the University of Texas, Austin to get that doctorate that I had not finished at LSU, and came back and moved into administration. While I was a faculty member, though, I was involved in writing the response to the self-study that had to come to SAC at that particular point about general education courses. And then moved into administration, became president at Central Virginia Community College, and became a peer evaluator with SAC, going on teams to other community colleges to evaluate their quality, and continued that when I was president at Northern Virginia Community College. When I stepped out as secretary, I had to get out of that. But as secretary, Virginia has the only one-term governor in the country, and it's a 4-year term. And so everybody starts looking for a job in year 3 of that 4-year term, and I was no different. And my predecessor, Dr. Jim Rogers, announced his retirement, and someone nominated me for this position. So I applied and apparently said the right things at the right time, because here I sit 18 years later as the president. But it was nowhere on my list of things to do growing up, as it were.
Well, I can well imagine that. Who'd have thought for me that I used to fly airplanes and spy on people for a living, and now I'm in education. So
there you go.
So I would be willing to bet that you have seen a few really interesting things over the years in higher ed accreditation. Any stories to share?
Oh, this podcast is not going to last long enough for me to share a lot of them. Most of the issues that get to my desk are challenges for institutions. Financial issues that are going on, faculty who don't understand why they have to do assessment, boards that are having challenges understanding, their role as opposed to that of the administration. And so when you compare it to all of the actions that our board addresses, there's not a whole lot of stuff going on, but boy, when they do, they are big ones. And so I spend a lot of my time going to institutions to do training sessions for board members, especially when a new president is coming on, so that they can start off on the right foot together, or at least on the same foot, knowing their appropriate role. Or I go to fall and spring convocations at institutions to talk to faculty about the importance of assessing student learning outcomes, and the pressures that their institution has through us from the Department of Ed, because if they want to continue to receive federal financial aid, then they have to do those kinds of things like assess whether students are learning and graduating and getting jobs and making money.
So what you're telling me is you're not the bad guy. It's the Department of Ed. Is that it?
I'm not saying that at all. I just said for student learning outcomes, that did surface first from the Department of Ed because they said, we're spending trillions of dollars in federal financial aid. What am I getting for my money? And it begins in the classroom, obviously. There are various reasons why students will not complete an academic program, but sometimes it's the institution and the people therein that are, not providing the kinds of support that students actually need to finish that degree program. So early on in my career, because student learning outcomes was a big deal, and it was the first time it was a big deal, then I spent a lot of my time talking to faculty members about why it was important for them to be concerned about whether students graduated or not. As a former faculty member, having an office mate who decided that his role was to weed out people who were not going to major in psychology, which made no sense in a community college. I understood that side of the equation that, wondered, well, it's not my job to help these students. They just have to get it on their own. And that just wasn't working. And so having had that experience and being able to, argue back and forth with him why that was not important, it made it easy for me to go talk with other faculty. Probably, most of the things that I could share with you have made the media, so there'd be no secrets to give. I remember in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the then governor terminated the membership of an entire institution's board. Well, we have a standard that says every institution has to have a process and legitimate reasons for getting rid of a board. But the Commonwealth of Kentucky had a law that gave the governor the authority to terminate a board if its membership was not representative of the people who lived in the Commonwealth. And so he took the opportunity to get rid of one of the university boards. Well, we look at an institution's policy. They had not referenced that law in their policy, and so we interpreted it as undue political influence. Oh, he was hot. He even made a YouTube video letting the voters in the Commonwealth know that he did not work for the accreditor. He worked for those people who elected him, and it was a mess. They did change the law, however. There was apparently someone in the House or Senate Education Committees that thought the governor had too much authority or something. I don't know what drove it, but they did change the law, and so we were able to square that one away. So that was a biggie.
Yeah. Let me guess, that gentleman in the Senate's first name might have been start with an L.
I don't even remember. That was long enough ago, and I've had too many other instances since. In the great state of South Carolina, we had a situation when the board was choosing a president, and the governor had been a voting member of the board. He stepped off the board and appointed someone to represent him, but then he started calling board members to tell them who he wanted to be president. Well, had he stayed on the board, we wouldn't have said anything about it because that would have been one board member talking to another. But since he was no longer on the board, that became undue political influence. So, those are the kinds of things that hit my desk.
Oh, joy.
I don't complain on payday, so I try not to complain any other day, Drumm. But it does present its challenges, yes.
Good philosophy. And of course, then you've got that one state that's down just a little bit south of you is.
Yeah, that's a big one that's come up right now. The state of Florida passed a law requiring their institutions to find another accreditor. They were not happy with some correspondence that we sent, and they felt that I had too much power, which I find fascinating since I don't get a vote in anything that goes on. This is a peer evaluation process, and I am not a peer to any of the institutions since I don't work in one of them. But to the chagrin of every institution down there, as far as I know, they have mandated that they have to find another accreditor. And so, yeah, that's a biggie, and I'm not quite sure that I can do anything about that.
Except now that the department is requiring you gain their permission prior to changing accreditors. So we'll see how that one plays out under a Democratic administration. Under Republican, I have no doubt what's going to happen.
Well, I don't know that that's true either because I don't know how the House and Senate Education Committees would interpret that. I mean, it's not an issue that an institution chooses its accreditor. That now they can choose their accreditor. Here, the institutions didn't get a choice, and that's the piece that is making it difficult for the institutions because the department has said this has to be voluntary. And I don't know how they're going to demonstrate that a law forcing them to do it is suddenly voluntary. So I have indicated to all of the institutions they are still our members with all of the rights, privileges, and responsibilities therefore to appertaining until they are no longer our members.
Mm-hmm. Are you sure that your degree is in psychology and not law?
Well, I told somebody I have 2 degrees in child psychology, and it prepared me to work for college presidents and politicians. Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm gonna do a little segue here. You said something earlier, and I want to put a plug in for being on a visiting team. Okay. Most folks stay at the same institution for many, many years, and they come up through the ranks. They learn those processes. But going on a visiting team, that really exposes you to a whole lot of other ways of doing things.
It does indeed. And I tell our evaluators all the time, obviously the new ones, that this is probably the best professional development activity out there because you learn something that you can always take back to your own institution, even if it's no more than, boy, I'm glad I don't work at that institution. Because they don't get out a lot, as you say, and so they feel like, oh, woe is me. I'm the only one who's experiencing this. I don't know what to do. But when you get out there and realize that you're not suffering by yourself, that there are other institutions that have declining enrollments, and here are the things that they're doing, to be able to increase them. I mean, every time we have folks go out and say, boy, I never thought about that. I think I'm going to take that back to my institution. Although we always remind them that they need to get permission from that institution to take back something that they learned there. But it is an eye-opening experience as well as a learning experience for many of our peer evaluators, which may explain why we have some peer evaluators who have been doing it for a very long time. So
Yeah, my experiences having done it with WASC and other accreditation bodies, it was invaluable for my learning about how other institutions do things.
Exactly.
So just a plug for, if you're not a peer evaluator, sign up. There's another piece that comes to mind with that is higher ed is not real good at training leaders. There's no real formal leadership development processes at most institutions. Some do, but this is another way to learn how other folks operate.
Yeah, I think there probably are not formal leadership training programs. I think a lot of folks assume that in graduate school you're going to get some example of how to lead, or just trial and error at your own institution. But I've seen many more institutions start their own leadership development programs and growing their own, probably because it's a lot easier when somebody already understands the philosophy of the institution and is familiar with its workings to move them up than it is to bring someone else in, take a chance that they don't like what they see and then leave very quickly. And a lot of our graduate programs are not producing enough leaders. One of the things that happened, I think, in the early 2000s, presidents started retiring en masse, and so did the vice presidents. And historically, the vice president has moved into the presidency, but the president stayed so long that they're both the same age, and so they ended up both leaving at the same time. And so, what do you do? Not only do you have to find a president, but now you have to find a VP Academic Affairs, a VP of Student Services. And so they said, we got to do something because graduate programs are just not producing enough people moving into the administrative pipeline. But the same thing's happening with faculty positions. It's getting tougher and tougher to recruit faculty members because folks are not going to graduate school and, in the numbers that they were in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And so you're having to grow your own.
Mm-hmm. And,
Yeah.
the Great Resignation is really putting a spotlight on all this.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Exactly.
Great Resignation, a lot of headwinds out there for higher ed, isn't there?
Yeah, it just seems like a tsunami of them right about now. We've always had challenges and changes coming our way, but it just seems like they're all swirling at the same time. You had the pandemic that we hadn't anticipated that set us back 2.5 years. You had, in our region anyway, you've got floods and hurricanes and tornadoes that, have closed institutions and slowed them down. We've had a lot of retirements that have gone up. We've had declining student enrollments, largely because of the pandemic, and it's just all happening at once. And then you've got the change in political ideologies, that's spreading across the country. And yeah, it's just all happening at one time, which is why retirement's looking better and better.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me is lions and tigers and bears. Oh
my. Yes, exactly. That's a good analogy. I like that one. Yeah.
And there is no silver bullet for any of these things.
No, it's not. It's not. And I had been a college president twice for a total of 10 years, and I said I would not go back to a presidency today full time if my life depended on it, because it is a very different job today than it was when I was in there.
Oh, huge.
You talk about food insecurity with students, for example. There was never anything, at least not on the level that you see it now. We always were aware that there were a couple of students here or there who, were struggling, but not enough to put in a food pantry at the college because students didn't have enough food. I mean, just mental health issues. We all get stressed out, especially over final exams or midterms or something, but not in the kinds of ways and to the levels that students today talk about having mental health issues. So, politicians have always wanted to tell you who to hire and, threaten your funding if you didn't give so and so a job or whatever. But it's just gotten worse. The ideas of academic freedom and post tenure review, those kinds of things have curriculum issues have always been the purview of the institution. That's why you hire faculty. They are the experts in their fields. And now politicians are saying, no, we're going to tell you what to do and when to do it and how to do it. And so all of that is just very different than it has been in the past.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, you've got serious issues with faculty burnout.
Yes, definitely.
I had a wonderful conversation with a professor from Rollins College who was talking about the faculty burnout, and especially with the mental health. Students are facing so many issues, and faculty, in many cases, are becoming informal counselors to them.
Yes.
And you can't help but take that stuff home with you.
Yeah, I remember and I know. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you talked about faculty, being in charge of their classroom and things like that. But yet Florida just passed a law. The governor said something that all syllabi have to be approved by the Department of Education down there or something along those lines.
Yeah, there are a lot of states that are beginning to talk about what you can't and can't teach, especially where it involves racial relations or sexual orientation. But Florida has stepped out and been much more prescriptive than some of the other states have been. Again, this is part of that new wave of politicization within higher education. They've always said we'll do this or do that, or developmental ed was the poster child for a while, and Florida was one of the first states that said we're no longer going to fund developmental education. But it's never been the wave across the country that it is. And, all 11 of the states in which we currently have members all have Republican governors. And so we're bleeding red over here. And it seems that when one of them does something, the other, follows suit. So,
I hate one-upsmanship.
I when I was Secretary of Education, the governor for whom I worked was Mark Warner, who's a Democrat, and the House and Senate both had Republican majorities, and it was probably the most frustrating time in my life because there were great ideas that the administration introduced that just because they were introduced by the Democratic administration wasn't going to see the light of day. And I don't deal well with partisan politics. I want to deal with issues. I want to deal with logic. I want to find compromise, which tells my age because I was around when Tip O'Neill and them used to do that. They would fight it out on the congressional floor and then go have a drink afterwards, and it was okay. There is none of that now, whether it's in the House, the state house, or the federal house. It just doesn't exist anymore.
No, and I think they've forgotten the whole purpose of education is to transform society, and we got to focus on student learning outcomes to make sure they're getting what they need.
Well, education for the public good is questionable right about now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's too bad. So, what's going on in accreditation?
Well, aside from institutions being able to choose their own accreditor at this particular point, in our particular region, as well as the other formerly known as regions, we're still dealing with student learning outcomes. That's still a big deal. We're trying to help institutions help their students get jobs, or at least leave the institution employable, whether they actually choose to become employed in the field in which they majored is something very different. One of the arguments that we have right now, or one of the perceptions, is that we don't do a good job because our graduates don't make the kind of money leaving their area. Well, the South doesn't pay the kinds of salaries that other parts of the country pay people. Have you looked at the salary range? It has nothing to do with the quality of the instruction. It has to do with the wages that employers offer.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to take that into consideration when you're being critical of, an education major in Minnesota is making $10,000 more a year than an education major in Texas. Well, yeah, or Louisiana or Mississippi, or pick a southern state. That's just the economy, stupid, as they say.
Yeah, Bill
Um,
Clinton.
yeah, but accreditors get blamed for it, that we're, accrediting institutions that don't have high quality. And so that's still out there with student learning outcomes. And the whole idea of micro credentials is a new one as well, because you've got McDonald's University and every other company developing their own credentialing programs that are now asking institutions of higher education to incorporate those credentials into their traditional degree programs so that students don't have to, retake courses when they've already demonstrated that they have those competencies. And so trying to find a way to assess the quality of those programs is still hanging out there, because we don't accredit those non-educational entities. We accredit institutions of higher ed that offer degrees. And so currently, we still hold institutions responsible for the quality of the work that comes from outside of their own walls or any other institution of higher ed's walls. And so that's getting bigger and bigger. Community colleges have been doing credentials for a long time, but now the senior institutions are beginning to be asked to accept some of those programs into their traditional degree programs. And so now people are starting to say, how do we do this? So that's a biggie that's coming out there. A lot of mergers and consolidations are occurring. A lot of smaller institutions, in order to stay in business, are finding partners with whom to merge so that they can stay in business, even though, since they can't do it by themselves. So enough to keep us busy.
There is absolutely enough to keep you busy. One of the big ones is the argument for compliance versus innovation. Most folks will say accreditation stifles innovation, which you and I both know is, I think we call it horse feathers.
There are probably times when, as an accreditor, we tell an institution, no, you can't do that. But generally, it's because they don't have enough money, they don't have enough staff, they don't are qualified staff, they don't have the facilities. Something is missing that would cause them to be successful in whatever it is they're going to do. We don't just look at an innovative idea and say, nah, that sucks. We don't want you to do that one. It's because there's a measure of quality that they have not demonstrated that institution possesses. When institutions have low enrollments, they get very creative on things that they want to do. But, come on, folks, you can't expect 500 new students to come in and you're not hiring any new faculty to accommodate them. You're not adding any classroom space or online instruction. So yeah, I'm sure there are times when accreditors stifle innovation, but it's only because there's something missing in whatever the proposal is. It's not because of whatever the proposal is, the content of it.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story. A friend of mine said she was the interim provost at an institution, and the music department was about to get closed, and the faculty, they had low enrollment. They had two students and 9 faculty members, and that's like, yeah, those numbers are off. But the faculty said, hey, if we had more faculty, we'd get more students. I was like, I don't think so.
Yeah. We've heard that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or adding a football team because you want to increase revenue. That never works either.
No, it really doesn't, because you end up giving more scholarships to the athletics than you do to students.
On top of your operating budget continues to bleed because it costs more to run a football program than you would imagine.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And, shared governance is in the news right now with academic freedom and, sometimes faculty thinking we should get the say in where we're going to put the next parking lot at the university and, things like that.
We're going through that right now. Our every 10 years, we do a deep dive into our standards. All of the accreditors do. And then mid-cycle, we say, okay, how are those changes we made last time working for us? And, is there something we need to revise? Is there something new we need to put in? When we did our review back in 2015 to 2017, approved by our members in 2017, we put in 2 new standards. One was that all governing boards needed to do an evaluation of themselves regularly, because we found that many times when an institution gets in trouble with us, their board has no clue what's going on. And so, because they have the fiduciary responsibility of the institution, it'd probably be a good idea if they talk about what they were supposed to be doing periodically and demonstrate that they are indeed doing it.
The
other standard, the other standard we added then was student debt was the issue du jour. And so the House Education Committee, at least, was talking about taking money away from institutions in subsequent classes when a previous class didn't pay their student loan. And I said, excuse me, let me ask this question, see if I understand. The federal government gives the money, and the federal government determines how much money a student gets, but you're going to blame the institution when the student doesn't pay the money back? That makes no sense to me whatsoever. But what does make sense is for us to educate students on what happens when you take out a loan and don't pay it back. Because this, for many of these students, no matter how old or young they are, it's the first time they've had a bucket of money, and don't understand this is not a grant. This is a loan, and there's compound interest when you don't pay it back. And even when you die, your estate has to pay back that money. So we put in a requirement that all institutions have to do financial literacy for students, whether they get federal loans or not, so that they understand when you go to a department store and get a credit card, you got to pay that sucker back when you run it up. And if not, the interest will accumulate. So this time, I'm getting back to your shared governance. I did not lose track. This time we're in the mid-cycle, and there are 3 subcommittees now looking at our standards. One is looking at the existing standards to see, are they still okay? Do they say what we need them to say? Do we need clarification? Whatever. We have one looking at shared governance with purported language on where to make changes in our current standard that would suggest, institutions have to demonstrate that they are asking faculty for their opinion on a variety of things. And then the third one is on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We don't have any standard that requires that except in our standard on student achievement. We do require our institutions to disaggregate data based on gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic level, whatever. And so the proposal is, and it's out to the membership right now, is that for that DEI requirement that we ask them when they look at their mission to explain how they address diversity, equity, and inclusion, when they look at their strategic plan to talk about how they address DEI, and then when they look at student achievement. That way, people understand that it's based on your own mission and your own, plan for carrying out your mission, that we're not asking you to change who you are, but tell us within the, structure of who you say you are and what you say you're going to do, how do you address those issues? So, yep, shared governance is a biggie. There was interesting pushback from the committee because, faculty's governance is in curriculum development. And it's tough for some of those presidents to say, sure, we want your opinion on where to put that parking lot or, whatever else. Yeah, no, they don't.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see what the membership says and how the presidents vote when it comes to the floor December of next year. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting that you bring that up because the standards are driven by the academic institutions.
Yes, they are. It is our members who decide what our standards will be.
And so with that, when you get all the political interference into the governance, that creates a whole kettle of fish. Can of worms, kettle of fish, whatever you call it.
I understood the analogy, and I get blamed for it. I'm the one that has too much power. I have no power. It would be nice if I had power. I have a lot of influence, but I don't have any power because it is our members that have to approve everything. We don't put in new policies without the board approving it, and the board is elected by the membership. We don't charge increases in our fees unless the board approves it, which is elected by the membership. We don't make changes in standards unless the membership approves it. So where's my power? Show it to me, Please tell me where it is. There is a grave misunderstanding over where these standards begin and end, but it is definitely our institutions that determine what the standards are.
And I think this is going to be a really good spot to tell our listeners, thanks for listening today, and a special thanks to Belle Wheelan for joining us. Join us next week for the conclusion of my interview with Belle. Until next time, remember, it's all about students.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.